So I thought I'd start by perhaps just slightly reframing the title for this session. I mean, very news when I saw Richard wants to talk about keeping bankers happy, but obviously, as you'll all be aware, firms have a very wide range of stakeholders to manage, and particularly finance providers. And I'm thinking here particularly about partners, whether that's actually through capital they've injected into the firm or via the undistributed profits that would obviously be sitting in the firm probably for some time after they were earned. And looking back at the PwC survey from last year, I was reminded that certainly for the top 50 firms, less than 10% of their funding actually comes from external funders like banks. And that only goes up to 15% for the rest of the top 100, so the sort of 51 to 100. So, the banking relationship is very important, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I think anything that Steve and I say here today is equally applicable to other stakeholders, and I say principally the partners, who obviously have a very large vested interest in the health of the firm and its ongoing success. And I suppose the first point I'd make is around communication. Clear, open communication at all times, as I'm sure you would do with your partners, is equally applicable to your banker. And increasingly today, I imagine that you will have multiple contact points with your bank or banks. And I suppose another point I'd be keen to make initially is that if you're working with multiple funders, then it's important to treat them equally, or as equally as you feel able in terms of the information that you share with them. Because, as I say, that sort of shared understanding, I think, is very helpful in ensuring you keep them all in a place where they feel able to support you and your firm. And that probably then goes on to the second point that I'd make around transparency. As well, no surprises approach is definitely the best way to operate in my experience. And I think that's no surprises on both sides. Clearly, any news the firm has, whether that's good or bad, is best shared early. And likewise, if the bank has news that it needs to share with you, then it's appropriate that they should be sharing that with you as soon as they reasonably can. If there's a change to a service they're offering you, or if there's a change to the way that service is going to be delivered, then clearly it's important for you and your planning that you're aware of that as soon as possible. So that, I would say, is a very reasonable expectation. But as Richard sort of opened up talking about perhaps the more challenging environment we find ourselves in, and my view would be that nearly all of the firms I work with, if not all of them, are very well prepared for what may come this year. We've been fortunate that whilst the pandemic did cause very significant sort of impacts on the British, UK and the global economy, the professional services sector actually weathered it reasonably well, and the LLP model in particular showed itself to be very flexible, and firms were able to build up cash reserves very quickly. Obviously, we've now entered a period where inflation is much higher, salary pressures have been significant, and some of those cash reserves are now being spent. But I think it's still fair to say that the sector is in good shape. Clearly, we always need to be mindful of clients that we're serving. That obviously us as your bankers, but obviously you as firms, and their demands are always increasing. Their desire to sort of have a broader, more complex service delivered at a lower cost is obviously a challenge that firms need to meet on a daily basis. And that then sometimes does require some flexibility in how the firm approaches its operations and the funding it needs to deliver those operations. And again, I feel that's an area where early engagement with your funders, whether that's your partners or the banks, is very helpful. And I suppose another observation I make is that I think the firms tend to be very keen to know what their peers are doing, or have an understanding of what their peers might be doing, but without necessarily wanting to sort of make direct inquiries, which is completely understandable. But no one seems to want to go first with a new idea or innovation. So I think there definitely are opportunities for firms to do things differently, and realise that sometimes that will require a change in approach to the funding.